Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we've got another single brewer review and we are coming back with two new beers from Founders. I'm always on the lookout for new releases they have out, and here are a couple that are brand new. I've never seen them before and I have certainly never had them. So I'm really excited to be jumping back in to some Founders action again. So today we are going to be reviewing two big fruited beers, different styles. The first one we're starting with is Agave. This is an imperial lime gose, clocking in at 10% ABV, which is really quite high for a gose. And this one has been brewed with agave and then aged in tequila barrels. So I'm expecting this is going to be quite a special beer. Number two, we're moving on to Blusing Monk. This is a Belgian-style ale that is brewed with raspberry puree, and this one clocks in at 9.2% ABV. So we've got two big fruited imperials here from Founders, completely different styles, and I'm really excited to jump in. Founders beers never do me wrong, and I'm always excited to try some new offerings that they put out. So we're going to get started with the Agave, the Imperial Lime Gose, brewed with agave, aged in tequila barrels, and clocking in at 10% ABV. Okay, so jumping right in with our first beer, this is Agave Imperial Lime Gose, 10% ABV. It's been brewed with agave and then aged in tequila barrels. So this is part of their barrel age series. I'm always excited when they put out some of these because I love barrel aged beers. They just add a whole nother layer of aroma and flavor dimensions and end up impacting multiple different facets of a beer, and I absolutely love it. So let's take a quick peek here. On the label art, it's kind of interesting. It's got some agave laying at the ground with a skeleton arm holding up a lime that has a butterfly atop it. So kind of ornate little label art there, but looks really neat. Nonetheless, let's get this one cracked. All right. And we're going to use the old Sam Adams tulip style glass today. Okay. Right away, this is quite a bit darker than your average gose, though this is imperial. And honestly, a little deeper, richer malt, in my experience, pairs very well with agave in beers. So I'm expecting some good things out of this. Yep, that's definitely a caramel color. It is not the classic pale straw yellow, but this is imperial. It's got a greater volume of malt and probably has some little deeper roasted malts, which honestly, for what they paired with it, I think it's probably the right call. Head formed quite well on this, actually. It's very atypical for a gose, but this is a much bigger beer, a much thicker beer, and it's a much heavier beer with a higher ABV. So I can't say I'm surprised that it actually did form and kind of retain a head, because it's so much thicker, it's not going to be quite as insane with the standard active carbonation you normally see in a gose. But it's already starting to dissipate and get out of the way here. Let's give it a sniff. Wow, that smells really good. You can smell that lime. It is intense. It's got a very strong lime aroma to it, and you can hands down smell that tequila barrel impact on this aroma. Hard to really say anything about the malts because the lime and the tequila comes through in a very prominent manner. It kind of is drowning out any nuance I might be able to get of the aroma that I normally would from the malt bill. But it smells very good. Let's just go ahead and jump right in. That head's pretty much out of the way. Let's do it. Oh man. Oh man. Wow. Okay, that is a really good beer. All right. The lime aroma and the tequila aroma that you get on the nose, that pretty much exactly but even more intense comes through in the beer. The lime pairs so well with the gose. It adds this natural acidity and super bright, citrusy, fresh tartness to an already sour beer style, and it just pairs beautifully. And the agave that's in there, that's what really is pairing on the back end with the malts, and it just adds this depth and layer and warmth to this caramel malt bill that comes through. The tequila marries perfectly with the lime. It's literally like back in school, you know, lining up the salt, grabbing the lime ready to bite, throwing back the shot, lick, bite, squeeze, the old, you know, that old how to do tequila shots back from college days. That's what it reminds me of. This is such a well thought out beer. It's a really, really, really well done. I'm going to jump back in for body mouthfeel and explore fully how these flavors develop and finish out. It's got a medium body. For 10%, you might expect it to be larger, but the body really comes through as medium. Mouthfeel, on the other hand, feels quite thick. It feels very thick and very viscous, which is very uncharacteristic of a gose. It also doesn't have that classic toasty, bready malt and kind of slightly dry finish at the end. It's just got so much more packed into the beer. I can't say I'm surprised by that. As an imperial, all bets are off. You know, it's not every day I have an imperial gose, but this is a special beer indeed. And it's very, very, very well balanced. I'm going to take one more sip here so I can walk through the exact way that the flavors develop and how they finish out. This is so good. Okay, it's big burst of lime and it just big burst of tequila. The lime is maybe a little heavier than the tequila, but not by much. Maybe 55-45 would be the percentage ratio wise. From there, those slowly, slowly dissipate in their intensity, and then you start to taste the agave, and it starts to marry with the malt bill. So you get this kind of buttery richness that mixes with this caramelly. So it's almost like a buttered popcorn, like caramel toffee popcorn is what comes through. That happens often with beers that are brewed with agave. It's such an interesting flavor and an interesting ingredient for beer. I absolutely love it. And pairing it with a more caramelly malt bill is a genius move. And that starts to intensify as the tequila and the lime kind of get out of the way. And then as that starts to decay, you kind of taste them all in equal parts. Lime, tequila, agave, buttery caramelly toffee, and it's got this underlying acidic and tart kind of side to it. And nothing about this is like a standard gose. None of the classic baked good kind of crust and bread and biscuity and the slightly dry, none of that's there. There's just too much substance to this beer, and honestly, it might be a little weird that way with what they did with this beer. For me, this is an absolute home run. I'm going to take my time sipping on this, calling my scores. When we come back, we're going to get to the Blusing Monk. That's the Belgian-style ale that's been brewed with raspberry puree, and that one clocks in at 9.2% ABV. Okay, now moving on to our second beer of today's Founders Review, we are moving on to Blusing Monk. This is a Belgian-style ale that has been brewed with raspberry puree, and it clocks in at 9.2% ABV. Terms of bottle art on this one, it's relatively subdued. Just says Blusing Monk and has a little, honestly, I don't even know what the picture is. Maybe a raspberry top view with the stem coming down. Hard to say. That's what it looks like to me anyway. Nonetheless, let's get this one cracked. Alright. And poured right in the glass. Oh, I'm beginning to see the namesake. It does have a rather ruby red kind of rosé, blushing-like appearance here. It's quite a lovely beer. Quite a lovely beer. Yeah, that's very nice. It's got looks a little ambery when you're pouring it, but in the glass, it's got a really nice deep ruby red color to it. It's very, very lovely appearance. Appears to be pretty active carbonation-wise here. Mix of small and medium kind of carbonation bubbles rising up pretty vigorously. Formed a pretty decent head on top, but due to the how active the carbonation is, I have a suspicion it's going to break away just because there's still so much coming up. It's going to collapse it from the bottom. But looks great. Let's give it a sniff. Oh, that's got quite a pronounced aroma. That smells very much like a framboise, a raspberry lambic to me. This smells strongly of raspberry, And it's got that kind of tart and sour aroma about it that comes through. It really does. If you blindfolded me and stuck this in a lineup with a bunch of raspberry lambics, I'm not sure I'd be able to tell that this wasn't one, just on aroma alone. It smells fantastic. Let's jump right in. Oh, that's another big beer. That's a very big beer. Okay, so this is very big. It's very raspberry forward. You really get a mouthful of raspberry. But what I would say is one of the major differences between this and, say, a framboise lambic is immediately apparent. I would know as soon as I got it in my mouth. While this does have a slight sweetness to it, so I think maybe they did brew similarly to how many Belgian brewers brew lambics. The fruited ones, they'll add a little sugar, lactose specifically, since it cannot be broken down by yeast into alcohol. It stays sweet to kind of accentuate the fruit and sweeten it up a little bit. This also doesn't have that sour edge that, say, a lambic has due to the wild yeast with which it's fermented. But it tastes very strongly of raspberry, slightly sweet, similar to how a framboise would be. But this, really you can tell it's a Belgian-style ale base because it's got a prominent booziness to it. 9.2% ABV, not that surprising, but it does come through in the base beer. So you get a sweetness and you get that tartness and that tang from the raspberries and just a mouthful of raspberries, but you get this big boozy back to it, and that kind of opens up into the underlying malts that they used as well. So I think that they did aptly categorize what this is. This is not trying to be framboise lambic by any stretch of the imagination, and they can't be. Lambics, we've talked about this on prior episodes, they are to the world of beer as champagne is to the world of sparkling wine or champagne. Only beers from a specific region in Belgium can be categorized technically and legally speaking as a lambic. If it doesn't come from that region, it's not a lambic. Same thing with champagne. If it doesn't come from that region in France, it can't technically and legally be categorized as champagne. At that point, it's sparkling wine. But nonetheless, this is a very, very good beer. I'm going to jump back in for body mouthfeel and see how this flavor develops. The body is medium heavy. It's probably about where I expected it to be, though. Honestly, I think 9.2, I would have expected a little more weight to it, but it's not off the mark by much. Mouthfeel is quite nice. It's got an interesting mix of kind of textures to it. It's got some viscosity to be sure. It's a thick beer across the palate. As you roll it around, it does take on a bit of a creamy edge, but it's also still quite effervescent, and it ends up with a rather dry finish on the palate, which sometimes can be a detriment to the finish, but this appears to have a decently long finish, even though it's dry, which tends to kind of just pull the lingering flavor capacity away from the palate, but this one's still sticking with me. So I'm going to jump back in here, have another sip, and see if I can pinpoint exactly how this flavor profile develops. First thing in the mouth, big, huge raspberry. Sweet and tart and raspberry. That keeps opening up and getting bigger, and then that kind of boozy edge comes in within about the first 3 to 4 seconds. You get that really boozy edge to the beer. That kind of opens up until that apexes in intensity as well. Then you start to get the base malt bill that comes in. All the while, you're still getting this kind of tart and sweet raspberry underneath the whole time, and it's still there. And that's essentially where the flavors break away, and then they're kind of all present in their own little kind of element within the flavor profile, but they don't kind of continue to peak and trough. So dominant from that point is hands down the raspberry. That is the dominant flavor. And behind that, it's probably 50-50 of the malt edge and the boozy edge to the beer. The booziness in this beer is not overwhelming, so it actually pairs well. And again, my thoughts, a big ABV beer, which this is at 9.2%, having a little booze edge to the beer is not a problem for me. Some people really dislike that. I don't. It lets me know I'm drinking a big beer. You know, it's just the way it goes. There's a lot of fermentables that went into this. It's going to have a little boozy edge to it typically at that ABV. But it's very, very well balanced. And the way the flavors develop really lets you be able to pick everything out. And in terms of the finish, at the very end, like I said, it's very noticeably dry at the end, but you're still left with this dominant lingering raspberry. That's at the very end of the finish. When it really dries out, there's that lingering raspberry. It doesn't have the sweetness and it doesn't have the tartness of the raspberry, and the malt's out of the way, the boozy back is out of the way, but you can still taste clearly and distinctly just a boatload of raspberry. It lingers all around the palate, so you're left with that on each sip. So it really finishes where it began. Overall, fantastic beer. I really enjoy this one. I'm going to take my time sipping on this. I'll come up my scores, and when we come back, we will get both beers rated from top to bottom. Okay, now that we've gotten to enjoy both of these beers, we're going to go through get them ranked, starting with the Mas Agave. This is the Imperial Lime Gose that was brewed with agave and aged in tequila barrels. The aroma on this one, very, very nice, very pronounced. You could smell it from a pretty good distance away, and when you did, it really hit you with lime. That was the overarching aroma that came through. Hint of the tequila, not really much in terms of the malt bill, and not really much in terms of the agave on the nose, but it was nice, and it was certainly well above average in how strong it was. I gave it a 9 out of 10. For the taste, I really, really enjoyed this beer. I really, really did. The only thing that I could say about the taste was making an imperial as a gose style. I'm not sure it translates well into imperial territory just based on the classic character traits of a gose. But that in mind, this did taste very good, and I kind of see where they were going with it. It almost reminded me of margarita beer. That's really the best way I could think of describing it, but not a crass interpretation. I mean, it really, all the component parts really work together. Really, for me to kick it up to that 10, I just would have liked a little more of that agave to come through, and maybe a little bit more of that classic gose malt bill. But again, as an imperial, you know, first imperial gose I've ever had, I'm not really sure it translates that well, but still, I gave it a 9. For the body on this one, at 10% ABV, I expected this to have a pretty substantial body, and it didn't. It was medium, maybe. It didn't really feel that weighty. It wasn't that robust in the mouth, and I was kind of taken aback at 10%. For me, I gave it the high end of average. I gave it a 6. For the mouthfeel on this one, the mouthfeel on the beer was certainly nice, don't get me wrong, but it did lack some of the characteristic traits that a gose typically does, namely in terms of the finish. They normally have this slight dryness to them on the back end, kind of finishes off, and that's really where the toasty and bready notes come into their own as it starts to dry out. This was so big and thick, and honestly, it was just too wet for the style. It felt nice. It was a very enjoyable mouthfeel, but for a gose, it didn't quite hit the mark for me. But since it was enjoyable, I decided to give it the benefit of the doubt. I gave it above average. I gave it an 8. Finish on this beer. The finish was quite nice. You certainly had a pretty decent bit of length, though not as long as I expected considering how big of a beer that it was and how bold the flavors were. It didn't last quite long enough, and frankly, I still could have used more agave somewhere in that finish. I got just hints of it, but I would have liked a little more. The lime may be overpowered just a bit. I gave it an 8. Head and retention, it was okay. It was above average. It formed a decent head, and it had decent retention, which is atypical for a gose. Not really what you want in a sour. This being an imperial, I had a hard time coming up with a gauge and a benchmark, so it didn't stick around super long, but it formed and it held okay. Since this is kind of its own animal, I decided to be fair, and I give it above average. I gave it a 7. Appearance-wise, it was a nice looking beer. Certainly far, far darker than a gose. But again, we're talking an imperial kind of version. It's not really a thing. I guess it is now, but it's not really a thing that I've ever seen anywhere or had. So my gauge is a bit off on this. Granted, it obviously had far more fermentables than your average beer, and clearly kind of their malt choice paired well with the ingredients they put in. So again, I decided to be fair with this one. I did give it above average. I gave it an 8. Balance on this. This was a good beer, and overall I thought it was well balanced, but I thought the lime might have been a bit too intense comparative to some of the other ingredients, and I really wanted more agave to come through. It was really lime and tequila. The lime was just a bit too intense, and it kind of drowned out that agave that they added in there, which is a really special ingredient for a beer. I did dock a couple points. I gave it an 8. Feeling in the intangible. I really enjoyed this beer. I really did. Subjectively, I thought it was fantastic. And I would have given it a perfect score subjectively, except I was just craving more agave than came through. I docked 1 point. I gave it a 9. Finally, as an example of the style, this is another category. I kind of struggled across the board where to place this because it was very enjoyable. But it's such a unique animal comparative to a standard gose. I wasn't really sure how to rank it across multiple categories here. But frankly, considering what they were trying to do with this and how well it was executed, I did, again, just go with my gut, and I gave it above average. I gave it an 8. That brings the total score on the Founders Mas Agave to an 80 out of 100. So certainly a well above average beer. And honestly, I personally enjoyed it far better than the score, which is quite high, belies. But I had to be objective as well as I could, even though I was a bit stumped in how to properly rate it in a few areas. But nonetheless, a fantastic beer. I really enjoyed it. Moving on to number 2, Blusing Monk. This is the Belgian-style ale that was brewed with raspberry puree, clocking in at 9.2% ABV. I really enjoyed this beer as well. These were 2 new to me Founders fruit-based beers, and I absolutely love them. The aroma on this one was even more pungent than it was on the Mas Agave, which kind of took me by surprise, but it was pungent raspberry all over the place. I give it a perfect 10 out of 10. For the flavor, absolutely loved it. It reminded me of a Belgian-style ale kind of take on a classic framboise. I mean, that's really kind of what it was. It was kind of an amalgam beer for me, and I absolutely loved it. The raspberry came through very strongly, as did the classic Belgian ale qualities of the malt bill and that slight boozy edge. I give it a perfect 10 out of 10. Body on this one. Just as with the Mas Agave, again, at this high ABV, I expected it to have a lot more presence than it did. I give it the high end of average. It gets a 6. Mouthfeel-wise, this one had a very nice mouthfeel. For a Belgian ale, Belgian-style ale rather, not Belgian-American, obviously, Grand Rapids, Michigan, but for a Belgian-style ale, it had a really nice mouthfeel. It was very classic. One thing I did like about this beer was it reminded me a lot of Framboise Lambics in that the finish was a bit dry on this beer. It did have a drying effect, and I really appreciated that because I had the classic Belgian style ale qualities up front and then a bit of that kind of nod to the lambic style on the back. I really enjoyed it. I give it a 9 out of 10. Finish on this one. This had a very long finish. It was actually a bit longer than it was on the Mas Agave, which I didn't actually anticipate, but I really appreciated. And you just kept tasting all the raspberry, all the interplay between the sweet and the tart and the malt bill and the kind of boozy edge to it. I really appreciated it. I give it a 9 out of 10. Head and retention on this one? It was okay. It was high end of average, but didn't really stick around as long as I would anticipate for a Belgian style ale. I gave it a 6. Appearance-wise, this was a lovely beer. It was a nice deep ruby red, which came from the raspberry clearly, but it had that classic Belgian style ale malt backbone base, so it wasn't a deep red like you'd see in a lambic, and indeed it shouldn't be. Completely different malt bill, but it was lovely. I gave it a 10 out of 10. Balance-wise, I thought this beer was balanced perfectly. I don't think I would change a thing about what they were doing with this beer. I think they absolutely nailed it. I gave it a 10 out of 10. Feeling in the intangible, I loved it. I did. Really not more to say that I haven't already said. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style, I teeter-tottered on this one. Not quite as much as I did on the Mas Agave, but I teeter-tottered on where I should really land this. I did dock some points in various categories, and they were for very good reasons. So I ended up going with my gut, and I only deducted 1 point with example of style because it was just so well done. It gets a 9 there. That brings the total score on Blusing Monk to an 89 out of 100. So 2 well above average offerings, excellent fruit beers, completely different, but both outstanding in their own right. And just another couple examples of why Founders is held in such high regard and why I enjoy them so much. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I sincerely appreciate you tuning in. Please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. And if you want to make sure you stay in the loop whenever videos go live, you can just click the notification bell icon that's right next to the subscribe button. Till next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.